Hello, this is Captain John Konrad coming to you live. Trying this out for the first time. Let's see how it works. I wanted to talk about something that's been getting a lot of attention on X, and that is drones on board ships. There's a comment, there's this rumor, there's this thought going out on the internet that ships are now obsolete in the world of drones, drone swarms, ballistic missiles. People look at the Red Sea and how the majority of ships are now rounding Africa instead of going through the Houthi controlled Red Sea. Does this mean that ships are now obsolete? Does it mean that warships should not operate anymore? The answer to that question is a resounding no. Why? Well, first of all, less importantly, is just the simple fact that arms are a race between technology that's offensive and defensive technology. We have destroyers in the Red Sea, which are getting targeted by ballistic missiles, drones, and unmanned surface vehicles, and they're not able to penetrate that defense of an Arleigh Burke destroyer. These destroyers are effective in shooting down these missiles, drones, and USVs. The question is, if they get inundated, a destroyer has a limited number of VLS, vertical launch systems cells, limited amount of anti-air weapons on board. What happens when they run out? Well, when they run out, the destroyer is not defenseless. They still have CWIS. They still have CRAM. They still can mount 50 caliber weapons, which may not be effective against ballistic missiles, but could potentially shoot down some drones, certainly some USVs. And as this technology improves, and as we move to things like laser defense systems, it's going to be an arm race as the drones get better. Hopefully, the defensive weapons get better. But what we don't have enough of is destroyers, which is why the U.S. Navy has created the Constellation-class frigate program. Smaller ships, they don't have quite as many VLS cells, but smaller ships that are able to escort merchant ships. Merchant ships are undefended. We have some security teams on merchant ships for piracy, but they certainly cannot shoot down drones and missiles. So what are we going to do? Let's get rid of ships, is what some people think. Let's move to air cargo logistics. That's not going to work, guys. The reason why is that if you combine all of the cargo carrying capacity of the entire United States Air Force, not just Air Force owned, but civil aviation that is contracted to the Air Force, it's less than the capacity of one mega container ship being built in China. 90% of everything goes by the ocean. And you can't lift that many supplies. Even if we had the capacity, people say, hey, what about the Berlin airlift? Well, the Berlin airlift was very difficult. It almost failed. We had a lot more planes back then. And they were just moving from Berlin to West Germany, a very short hop. When you have a very long hop across the Pacific, that length takes capacity out of the system. It's problem one. Problem two is we don't have enough oil tankers or air tankers to refuel these Air Force logistics planes. So even if you had enough in-air refueling to cover that distance, you still have the problem of those in-air refuelers have to land at forward air bases in places like Midway and Guam, hopefully Japan. Well, where do those areas get their fuel from? The answer is oil tankers. Steve Carmel, former senior vice president for Maersk, said we need at least 100 and we only have access to about 10. So forget about the air cargo, and those air cargo are going to be busy doing other things. We need ships, and that's just military supplies. What about grain? What about fertilizer? If you have major choke points shutting down around the world, millions of people are going to starve. Economies will go into depression. That was the primary cause of the Great Depression 100 years ago, was tariffs and close down of ocean trade. So there's no other option. We need ships. We need to figure out how to protect ships, merchant ships and warships. If we can't figure that out, we are in a world of hurt. So Admiral Stavridis wrote an op-ed in Washington Post about how we're protecting ships, and I wrote an op-ed for G Captain that is going to show us how we can protect these ships, what is needed. And I'm just going to read this off for you. So, are ships obsolete in an age of drones and missiles? Admiral Stavridis says no. By John Konrad, G Captain. In Admiral James Stavridis' recent hard-hitting Washington Post op-ed, he reminds us that warfare often defines easy narratives, and his analysis of the state of naval power in the drone era hits squarely at a key tension. Are large surface warships obsolete, or are they still essential to maintaining global stability? For G Captain readers, this is more than just academic. It's the future of stability and risk in maritime industry's future. Stavridis presents a nuanced perspective that navigates between two seemingly contradictory truths. Surface ships are, in fact, vulnerable, but are not obsolete. Stavridis starts with the remarkable fact that Ukraine, a nation without a traditional navy, has crippled a significant portion of Russia's Black Sea fleet. This was accomplished using intelligence and unmanned drones, a potent combination that has reshaped how we think about naval warfare. At first glance, this might signal the death knell for large surface warships. If drones and missiles can neutralize a fleet with no navy to speak of, what chances do hulking destroyers and cruisers, let alone merchant ships, have in the face of similarly equipped adversaries? So this is not just the drones and the missiles. Let me pause. It is also that we have more intelligence, better satellites, distributed human networks that can talk over encrypted applications like Telegram, and artificial intelligence that can analyze all of this data. Let me return to the article. However, Stavridis rightly points out that the story isn't that simple. The vast majority of global trade still relies heavily on large ships, and while drones are rewriting the rules of naval engagement, we can't abandon the seas to them just yet. As long as world trade moves across the ocean surface, we'll need ships to protect vital sea lanes. In this regard, Stavridis underscores that the U.S. Navy, and by extension, Allied navies, still have an irreplaceable role. China, with its aggressive shipbuilding program, clearly understands this, and the U.S. should take note. Let me pause again. Why is shipbuilding important? Because we need more warships to protect the merchant ships. One. Two is when merchant ships get hit, whether it's in a blockade or aggressive war action, you need to repair those ships. You need salvage ships, floating dry docks, fireboats in order to save damaged ships. We don't have very many of those. China does. Repair yards. Our repair yards are already at capacity during peacetime. What will happen in wartime? Will we be able to repair those damaged ships and get them back out there in trade? Let me continue. What the Admiral's article gets absolutely right is the dual-tracked future of naval warfare. We need unmanned systems, and we still need surface fleets. Surface warships may be vulnerable, but they are indispensable for now. He draws a historical parallel to Pearl Harbor when battleships gave way to carriers. But he reminds us that even today, we need carriers, destroyers, and cruisers to project power and protect commercial vessels from the threats like Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. Inflation is already surging due to port congestion and diversions around Africa to avoid the Red Sea, but the sobering reality is that with large number of ships sinking, global trade would grind to a halt, creating an economic crisis not seen since the Great Depression. Such an economic collapse would devastate nations, and a world deprived of food and fertilizer shipments would face widespread famine, starving many millions. Even the most aggressive nations would recoil at such dire consequences. Let me pause. This is primarily an economic. We're not even talking about the extension of war or fighting the war. It's prevention of economic collapse. What else happens when you have scarce resource, scarce amounts of oil, energy, because oil tankers are getting hit, scarce amounts of food and fuel? Well, each nation starts acting in their self-interest. Alliances could collapse, creating larger geopolitical problems. Continue. A more likely scenario is an arms race where more ships of all types and flags are armed with more radars, more armed guards, more drones. Missiles and defensive weapons systems. Sorry, I lost my place here. Stavridis leaves us wanting more regarding the practical logistics of balancing these two forces. While he says that technology like anti-drone lasers and missile defense systems are essential and should be developed, questions remain. How quickly and at what cost can we realistically scale up those defenses? How many systems like Sea-Wiz do we have in storage, ready to be mounted on sea lift ships at the outbreak of war? How quickly can new technology be deployed at sea? What types of ships in what regions will need the strongest defensive systems? Do ports, shipyards, and naval bases also need to be protected from drones? How many salvage ships, tugboats, fireboats, and dry docks will be needed to mitigate and repair ship damage? Surface warships will certainly be relevant for convoy protection, but the U.S. lags behind China in shipbuilding pace. Allied efforts to expand naval fleets range from slow progress, places like Australia, Japan, France, where they are looking to ramp up naval spending, but potentially not fast enough, to utter failures. Canada, New Zealand, Denmark really only have navies in name only. They just don't have enough ships, and the ships they have are too small and vulnerable. In the United States, many advocate for Army and Air Force spending over naval forces, while the U.S. Coast Guard and U.S. Merchant Marine receive little public or media attention for funding. Even with the Navy, pushes to expand the fleet of submarines and aircraft carriers often overshadow the need for smaller, well-armed frigates capable of protecting ships, ports, and supply lines. So this is an important factor. Yes, we need more carriers. Yes, we need more submarines. But how effective are submarines in anti-air maneuvers in protecting merchant ships? They are more of an attack type of weapon rather than a defensive one. While armies, air forces, and submarines excel at projecting power, our future economic stability will hinge on protecting trade, as it did in earlier times, rather than waging war. Historically, safeguarding ocean-going vessels from enemy threats has been the most crucial priority, even during wartime. In the current Red Sea crisis, however, traditional military assets like armies, air forces, carrier strike groups, and submarines are proving ineffective at defending merchant ships. Surface warships like the powerful Arleigh Burke-class destroyer are excelling in this defensive role. But there simply aren't enough warships in all of NATO's mighty arsenal combined to do the job effectively, because NATO has focused more on land and air power than sea power. Let me pause again. We fought 20 years of global war on terror, and allied nations, even allied nations which are historically sea power, like the Netherlands, like the United Kingdom, like Italy, have put a larger percentage of their defense budget into air and army. This is just a fact. Our own army has moved money from watercraft, which are essential logistics tools, especially as we move to the Pacific, Army Corps of Engineers, which does waterway, dredging, bridges, port development, as we're seeing in the Army's failure to build out the port in Nome, Alaska. Over the beach logistics, JLOTS, as we've seen the failure of the Gaza Pier. Our own Army has taken money away from these maritime capabilities and put it into tanks, weapon systems, and other land power things. These land power things, as they are needed to complete a war, but the opening stages of a war are really naval, because it's so critical to secure the economy and the movements of goods so we can ramp up that war machine. Would an adversary like China even have to declare war if it armed its vast merchant navy, maritime militia, Coast Guard with anti-ship missiles, while its navy, now larger than the United States, protects the Chinese merchant navy from us? Could they simply sink allied merchant ships bound for the United States, sending the entirety of North America into a deep economic depression? Pause again. So what happens if the thousands of merchant ships in the Chinese merchant navy are armed with drones? We already know that the seafarers on Chinese merchant ships have military training. They have advanced communication gear, and they have a communist CCP commissar on board these ships. If they could put 10,000 drones in a container, and as that container goes into, say, the port of San Diego, port of LA, these drones swarm out. What are our defensive systems? This was first brought up in the Peter Singer's book, Ghost Fleet, an excellent fictional book about a war with China, but based on technological and true facts. So please go read that book. But what if a Chinese merchant ship is coming past a U.S. carrier in the Malacca Strait? someone on that merchant ship jump out with a missile system, the Javelin type missile, maybe larger, and attack that carrier, attack the destroyer? These are questions we have to ask, and we're not well prepared for. We're not well prepared for because the DoD does not understand the merchant marine and the capabilities. If you go, there's not one U.S. merchant marine captain like myself anywhere in the Pentagon, in the think tanks, in the war colleges, in these places that create policy and drive the future fight. Let me return. Is it possible that many, certainly not all, of China's warships are smaller and less capable than ours because they are not intended to project power, but instead protect ships and trade? So that's a criticism we get. People who say, well, China has more warships, but they're smaller. They're not as capable as a destroyer. Okay, well, what is the purpose of those ships? They're all concentrated in the South China Sea. They can just protect their merchant shipping, their ports, their infrastructure, while ours are being attacked either by drones or potentially adversaries who are crossing the southern border and ready to sabotage systems in the United States, water systems, power systems, ports, shipyards, repair yards. Maybe they don't have to be offensive. Maybe those smaller ships are better at defending what they need to defend. I'll continue. If we're going to maintain both unmanned and surface capabilities, how does the U.S. Navy plan to close the gap? The gap, particularly with China. But we also see Russia right now, as we speak, is having naval war games south of the Strait of Hormuz with Iran as they join forces with China and potentially North Korea and potentially other smaller nations that they've invested in heavily. Panama, they bought a lot of land and a lot of influence in Panama. Maybe it's very unlikely that Panama joins a war, but maybe Panama does not join a war on our side and prevents the movement of warships. Another choke point closed. I'll continue. Stavridis' point that the bad guys get smart eventually, unquote, is especially poignant. Russia has already adapted to some drone tactics in Ukraine, and we're sure to see adversaries evolve even more creative ways to neutralize both surface ships and drones alike. It's a constant arms race, and that's exactly why this debate matters so much. The future of the sea is not either drones or ships. It's both, operating in tandem. And for the U.S. to succeed, it needs to stay ahead in both domains. This situation poses a significant problem. While the Department of Defense is committed to developing drone swarm capabilities, such as their replicator program, it's not equally focused on shipbuilding or repair or salvage or these other things we've talked about. Today, every single U.S. Navy shipbuilding project faces delays. Furthermore, the Coast Guard lacks robust anti-drone and missile defense systems. Additionally, there are fewer than 100 U.S. merchant marine ships engaged in international trade overseas, and these vessels lack even non-lethal defensive systems. Could we potentially put a Sea Whiz on board merchant ships? Potentially. Could something like Anduril, Palmer Luckey's company, develop electronic warfare systems to give some basic protection to merchant ships? Potentially. But right now, we don't have those systems on board merchant ships. If a naval drone and missiles arm race has already started, the Pentagon seems oblivious to this new reality. In conclusion, Stavridis offers a sobering but hopeful outlook. The rise of unmanned systems doesn't mark the end of surface warships, but it does signal the need for navies around the world to evolve. For the U.S., that means accelerating shipbuilding, advancing missile and laser defenses, and ensuring we're not outpaced in drone warfare. It requires thinking outside the box. Could some of the Army's mobile, I was just at AUSA, the big convention, they have mobile defense systems, mobile rocket systems. Could these be mounted on U.S. flag merchant ships? Could we get allies to join so we have allied ships? If not, can we arrest ships and put our people on it? There's a huge merchant marine shortage in the United States. So who's going to man these ships even if we do arrest them? And how long will it take to outfit them with the most basic defensive systems? We could easily put 50 calibers, maybe small deck guns like we saw in World War II on the merchant ships. But in this electronic age, we need anti-drone systems. We need AI connected with radar so we can understand the threat. We don't have those right now. The maritime world is transitioning, but like any good ship captain knows, smooth seas never made a skilled sailor. His conclusion is stark but important. Should the United States spend more money building surface warships or spend that money on drones? Admiral Stavridis' answer, both, please. We can click on his excellent Washington Post article where you should go read. Again, this is a difficult problem. Defending ships, scaling out both offensive drone capability and defensive ships, merchant ships, warships, Coast Guard cutters. This is an extremely difficult and hairy problem. But there is no alternative. We cannot put this cargo on air. There is no railroad or roads to the Pacific. It has to go on ships. Ships are the only means to move the vast quantities we need. And if we don't protect those ships, if we don't protect trade, there's going to be huge economic penalties, a depression. We're going to lose allies, and we can probably feed ourselves. We have enough energy to energize ourselves. The United States may be okay, but millions of people around the world are going to starve if the ocean trade routes start closing down. So, thank you for joining me. I ask you to please go to GCaptain and subscribe. In this right-hand corner, you can put your email address, hit subscribe, and get our free daily newsletter. You'll also have the option of getting weekly newsletters in topics like defense and shipping. Go on x.com, subscribe to GCaptain, Facebook as well, and you can visit me on X at John Konrad, Konrad, all one word, on X, where I'm putting out some of the GCaptain articles are very well researched, very well edited and checked out. But some of the newer things and where I push the boundaries sometimes a little too far into politics, geopolitics, future warfare, I tend to put those things on X. So please subscribe to my X and please post any questions you have. Like this video and share. Please share. We need these ships. That's the bottom line. We can put Army tanks on ships. We can put creative solutions. We can use AI to help reroute ships in traffic. We could potentially arrest ships like we have done in the past, but we really need merchant mariners. We really need people to sign up and learn how to drive ships. And we need things like salvage fireboats to protect the very few ships that we have, or we're going to be in deep problems quickly. And this is not just about famine overseas. We will need to resupply our hundreds of thousands of servicemen and women and American citizens living overseas, 100,000 in the Pacific alone. And we'll need to evacuate them. And you cannot evacuate that number with planes, especially if China or an adversary has anti-air weapons. We're going to need to use ships to evacuate those people. So even though the United States is potentially okay, the economy will not, and those Americans living overseas will not if we don't start to get our act together right now. Thank you very much. Captain John Konrad. Like and subscribe to the video, and have a great day.